Many of you, I think, have attended the previous talks that he did on the emotional life of your brain and then how stress gets under our skin. And tonight, the topic is the science of transformation and human flourishing. Um, I am Amy Roth. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I practice psychotherapy. And I'm also a practice leader of the Turgar meditation community here in Chicago. And I will be presenting and guiding some meditations, doing some practice with you all, along with Robin Nusslock, who is an associate professor of psychology, psychiatry, and neurobiology at Northwestern University, where he serves as director of affective and clinical neuroscience laboratory and the Center on Social Disparity and Health. Robin is a valued member of our community, our Turgar community here in Chicago, and he is also a former student of Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin, whose work we will be referencing several times tonight, as well as a colleague of Cortland Dahl, who is the executive director and instructor for Turgar, and is also, I think it's safe to say, probably Mingyur Rinpoche's most senior student here in the West. And so we are lucky to have Robin, and we are lucky to have the opportunity to come together to explore some of the science around change and transformation, and then what our meditation practice can do to help foster that. So let's see. Well, I thought maybe to begin, we could start by reflecting on one of Mingyur Rinpoche's quotes from his book, The Joy of Living. It's one of my favorite quotes from Rinpoche. Ultimately, happiness comes down to choosing between the discomfort of becoming aware of your mental afflictions and the discomfort of being ruled by them. And for those of us in the Turgar practice group, I think we have a lot of experience with that. And but I think the main takeaway for me is that there's discomfort either way. So oftentimes what we talk about in meditation is that we are practicing getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. And so that's part of what we're going to be working on, turning toward tonight. Let's see. Another very well-known Buddhist monk and scientist is a man named Mathieu Ricard. He was a cellular geneticist, had a very privileged life in France, and he gave it up to become a Buddhist monk. And he has had a very fascinating career for the last 50 years at the foot of some of the greatest masters of the 20th, 21st centuries. And he too is a personal friend of Richie's and has been in the lab at the University of Wisconsin. And so I thought it might be appropriate to refer to some of his words. And so just to kind of as inspiration for tonight, I was going to read a passage from his book, Why Meditate? So, we have no choice about what we already are, but we can wish to change ourselves. Such an inspiration gives the mind a sense of direction, but just wishing is not enough. We have to find a way of putting that wish into action. We don't find anything strange about spending years learning to walk, read and write, or acquire professional skills. We spend hours doing physical exercises in order to get our bodies into shape. Sometimes we expend tremendous physical energy pedaling a stationary bike that goes nowhere. To sustain such tasks requires a minimum of interest or enthusiasm. This interest comes from believing that these efforts are going to benefit us in the long run. Working with the mind follows the same logic. How could it be subject to change without the least effort just from wishing alone? That makes no more sense than expecting to learn to play a Mozart sonata by just occasionally doodling around on the piano. We expend a lot of effort to improve the external conditions of our lives. But in the end, it is always the mind that creates our experience of the world and translates this experience into either well-being or suffering. If we transform our way of perceiving things, we transform the quality of life. It is this kind of transformation that is brought about by the form of mind training known as meditation. And we're going to hear these ideas of training and, well-being. Well-being is a skill that can be trained. A lot about transformation, how as we transform, Ricard says the aim of meditation is to transform the mind. And as a meditator myself, I've noticed that meditation has like changed my experience of the world, and then that in turn changes the world that I experience. So I remember when I first started meditating, I really didn't like that idea. Like we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And I didn't really like that. But the more that I've practiced and the more that I have brought compassion into what comes up for me as I sit on the cushion, I've noticed a softening and a change in the way that I view the world. And it does change the world that I'm experiencing. And we see and notice and have opportunities that perhaps we wouldn't have had we not. So, so again, what are we doing here? You know, Matthew Ricard says the aim of meditation is to transform the mind. And so I kind of like to think about it as we're transforming our relationship with our minds. So again, let's go to Mingyur Rinpoche and get a little bit of inspiration from him. Unfortunately, one of the main obstacles we face when we try to examine the mind is a deep-seated and often unconscious conviction that we're born the way we are and there's nothing we can do to change that. I experienced the same sense of pessimistic futility during my own childhood, and I've seen it reflected again and again in my work with people around the world. Without even consciously thinking about it, the idea that we can't alter our minds blocks our every attempt to try. People I've spoken with who try to make change using affirmations, prayers, or visualizations admit that they often give up after a few days or weeks because they don't see any immediate results. When their prayers and affirmations don't work, they dismiss the whole idea of working with the mind as a marketing gimmick designed to sell books. However, during my conversations with scientists around the world, I've been amazed to see that there is a nearly universal consensus in the scientific community that the brain is structured in a way that actually does make it possible to affect real changes in everyday experience. So again, Matthew Ricard, Rinpoche, they talk about, is change possible? And if it is it preferable? And that's a question that we can each ask ourselves. And so again, getting back to this transforming our relationship with our mind. Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of the concept of the monkey mind. So that's our normal kind of discursive mind that we normally relate to, the emotions, the thoughts, the phenomena, the planning, the ruminating, all of that, the content of what we often think of as ourselves or our mind or our thought stream. That's what we refer to as the monkey. It's like a crazy monkey. It's just running all over the place. It's kind of cute, but it really can make a mess, especially when it's left on its own. And so often how we normally refer to the monkey is as an enemy or as a boss. But either way, we think we have to argue with it as if it's telling the truth, or we have to obey it as if it's telling the truth. And so the process of meditation helps us to tame that crazy monkey and hopefully turn it into a friend. Now that may sound, kind of lofty or Pollyanna or what have you, but I can assure you it is a challenging and rewarding experience. And I would also say that we can also have a sense of humor about it. And one of my favorite lines is meditation sucks, and I highly recommend it. So how do we do this? Well, the way Mingyur Rinpoche teaches us is it's through the cultivation of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. And so what are these things? What is awareness? Well, awareness is the mind that knows. It's just that knowing quality of mind. It's always with us. Like Rinpoche says, so close, we can't see it. It's like when you try to see the nose on your face. It's really hard to do. It's so easy, we miss it. And so the practice of meditation is just continuing to back and forth over and over again. Can I recognize this knowing quality and just rest there? And then I get lost, and then I come back. And then I get lost again, and then I come back. So again, we're just familiarizing ourselves with the way the mind works. And a lot of people who come to meditation are seekers. They say that a lot of people who come to meditation are neurotic and curious. And all of those things provide a lot of good fodder and a lot of good skill for the practice of meditation. So what if we just took a few minutes right now and practiced and see if we could get in touch with this awareness that Rinpoche is talking about. So if everyone would just get a little comfortable. As we say, bring your mind into your body and your body onto your seat. Let's just begin by reflecting on our motivation for being here today. Let's cultivate the wish that calming our minds and opening our hearts will bring peace and happiness, not only to our own lives, but also to the lives of others. Recognizing all beings share the desire to be happy and free from suffering just like we do. And let's set the intention and the aspiration that any benefit that comes from this conversation will radiate out to benefit all beings. So just sit with your spine loosely straight. Let your body be as relaxed as it wants to be right now. Just notice what's coming up. You may sense tension in your forehead or face or your shoulders. You may notice pain, buzzing, or numbness. You may not notice anything at all. Whatever's coming up for you is perfectly allowed. Just let it be. Now you can expand your awareness beyond the body to your surroundings. Bring your attention to whatever sounds, smells, or sensations that you experience, and let your awareness become more open and vast as you stay with each for just a few moments. We don't need a perfectly quiet place to meditate. We can bring our awareness to anything that's arising around us. It's all support for meditation. Now expand your awareness even further, beyond your immediate surroundings. Feel the space around you, above you, in all directions. And just rest in the awareness of this space. Just like clouds, all phenomena occur in space, change in space, and dissolve back into space. Now you can expand your awareness, going beyond the clouds into boundless space, open in all directions. And just rest there for a few moments. So now that we've all arrived, I'll hand it over to Robin.
Okay, can you hear me? I would like to ask that I begin every talk with a 20-minute meditation from Amy. So it's really wonderful to be here. So some of you have participated in all three of the conversations that we've had this winter. This arose out of a conversation that Amy and I had of, we're living in a pandemic. How do we increase community? How do we come together as a group, as a fellow travelers, and explore some of the things that we all experience, which is our mind. And so the first of our three conversations was an introduction to the neuroscience of emotion, and I'll review some of that this evening. The second asked the question of how stress in our world gets underneath our skin, and provided an introduction to some of the work on brain immunology. And tonight, we wanted to do a bit more dialogue between practice and science to get more of a taste of some of the stuff that we'll be discussing. And what I'll be discussing tonight is current research on the neuroscience of plasticity, on genomic plasticity, and in particular, how meditation can change our mind, bodies, and brains in ways that promote well-being and human flourishing. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to go back and have another teaching from Amy and some more guided meditation, and then I'll come back. And so Amy and I are kind of going back and forth tonight, and I think it'll be really fun. So I'm actually going to share some slides just to provide a little bit of context. So let me take a second here and get. I'd like to start this conversation with a quote by the Dalai Lama that really, I think, connects with some of the content that I'll be just trying to discuss tonight, which is the systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenges and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. Now, what's interesting is that in 1890, a very different person said a fairly similar quote, which is, and the faculty of voluntarily bringing a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of character and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. And this is William James, who's considered by many to be the founder of Western is my camera off now, Amy?
You've got two cameras on, just go, it's fine. It's just your arm, it doesn't matter.
No worries. We're seeing the
I see, I've got two cameras on there.
slideshow anyway, so.
So this is William James, who is basically the founder of Western psychology. Actually, the psychology department at Harvard is called William James Hall. And, there's been this kind of interest in ways of exploring mind in both West and East. And I would say it's just been recently where these worlds have intersected. And I think that really Richie Davidson and others are spearheading this conversation between East and West in really profound ways. And so Richie has played a very substantial role in my own life, where I've had the privilege of working with him as both undergrad and as a grad student. And, he's basically initiated a very sophisticated conversation between Buddhist monks and practitioners and scientists about the malleability, about the flexibility, about the nature of mind. And this is Matthieu Ricard, whom Amy referred to earlier, who is a wonderful practitioner of Buddhist and meditation and also a scientist. And Richie has brought some of the expert meditators from around the world and ask the question of whether or not their brains functionally and structurally look different than people who don't engage in such techniques. And so has done some very interesting work really putting forth tools and technologies to study these Olympic athletes of mind. But what's also important is he's also, and many other folks as well, have examined what it looks like if you are just learning to meditate or learning to engage in these techniques, and how does that affect your brain function and brain structure, and I'll be talking about that. And obviously Richie is a central member of the Turgar community and worked very closely with Mingyur Rinpoche and is working very closely with Mingyur Rinpoche. This is a picture of Mingyur Rinpoche's in Richie's lab. This is Cortland Dahl, who Amy referred to. And I feel that we as a Turgar community are just very fortunate to be in a situation where there's such a rich conversation between these different traditions of examining mind through Buddhist approaches and through science. And so I really want to today discuss what the research is showing to us about the nature of mind, the nature of the malleability of the mind through the technique of meditation. And Richie mentions that there is no organ in the body that's more designed to change in response to experience than the brain. And this really highlights the fact that the brain is meant to, designed to, wired to change in response to experience. And this introduces a very important term of neuroplasticity, a term that many of us have probably heard. And neuroplasticity is just referring to the fact that the mind and brain change in response to experience. You see structural, you see functional, you even see, cellular and genomic changes in response to experience. But a point that I emphasized in my second conversation this winter is that neuroplasticity is agnostic to direction. So if you engage in, unhealthy or kind of self-destructive behavior, you will see unhealthy and self-destructive neuroplastic changes to the brain. By contrast, if you engage in productive, self-enhancing and growth-oriented behaviors, you will see positive neuroplastic changes to the brain. And the idea is that the brain is a bit of a blank slate. You will see changes in upward or downward directions depending on the nature of what you put into the brain and the way you engage with it. What's intriguing is that there's also evidence to suggest that this malleability of biology exists at many different levels of analysis. So we see it in the brain, we see it in the immune system, we see it in the gut, we see it in peripheral physiology, and there's also evidence to suggest that there's a certain degree of malleability and plasticity in the genome. Now, we all have a fixed complement of DNA base pairs. I'm not suggesting that we live in some magical quantum world where we can rewrite our DNA. But genes are regulated by mechanisms that increase or decrease that signaling in the genome. You could think of these mechanisms, whether they're gene expression pathways or epigenetics, as being like dimmers on a light. They kind of turn up or turn down the light, depending on the need for that particular biological system. And again, we see positive or negative plasticity in the genome, depending on how people are engaging in their lives. And I think this really raises the fact that well-being is a skill. It's not something that just is endowed to us that we just kind of do. It's something that we practice. It's something that we engage in. It's something that we make the intention to pursue. And as Amy alluded to, it's really freaking hard and it takes a lot of work. So what I want to do in my comments tonight is really explore some of the research on the science of transformation and human flourishing to see what's out there and see what the potential is for us to change our own minds and bodies. So just very briefly, I just want to mention some of the brain regions that we discussed in our previous talks. We talked about the amygdala, which you could think of as the brain's brake pedal. It's a vigilance system, it's a salient system. It's designed to initiate a freezing response. So think of the amygdala as a defensive state. We talked about the ventral striatum, which you could think of as the brain's gas pedal or accelerator. It's designed to get you leaning towards and moving towards and leaning into the goals that you want in life. It's very much involved in reward processing. And then we talked about this piece of tissue right behind our foreheads, which is an executive control system. It's thinking systems and cognitive systems. And these systems really help us manage our emotions and kind of regulate them. I'm going to be pulling from the Turgar team, Cortland Dahl and Richie Davidson and Christine Wilson Mendenhall, to kind of provide a structure for my comments. And this is a new paper that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by Cortland and senior author by Richie, to provide a model for human flourishing. And I'm going to slot in some research on the neuroscience of human flourishing in each of these respective domains. And what Richie and Cortland and others do here is that they propose the idea that there's really 4 pillars to a healthy mind. One is awareness, one is connection, one is insight, and one is purpose. And I'll be walking through each of these themes and providing some of the research to support each of these respective topics. So the first is awareness, and awareness could be thought of is basically an attention, a presence to the present moment. So self-awareness in particular. And this is the idea that can you actually bring attention? Can you actually bring awareness? Can you actually bring a certain degree of presence to your moment? And the term that is often used in this paper is meta-awareness. So meta-awareness is kind of the idea of the mind being aware of what the mind is doing. And you could say that in a sense, that's the hub of meditation. And Amy did a very nice job of alluding to that. So this is the idea that if, let's say you're entranced in the moment, or you're reading a book and all of a sudden you kind of lose touch of where you are in that book. And then all of a sudden you have that moment like, oh my gosh, an hour, 10 minutes or 5 minutes has just gone by and I didn't know what I've been doing. It's that moment where you bring awareness to what you're doing and have that degree of presence to the moment. And there's evidence that we struggle with this, that this is not a natural state. This is really highlighted in a study by Dan Gilbert, in which he did something very simple but very profound. He texted people throughout the day, and he texted people multiple times throughout the day. There was a few thousand people in this study. And he said, what are you doing? Where is your mind? And how happy are you? And what was extraordinary is that Dan Gilbert reports in this study that 47% of the time, on average, we're not paying attention to the present moment. And that's, to me, a pretty striking number, that literally half of our lives, we're not in the present moment. And what's interesting is that Gilbert reports in this study that when people weren't paying attention, they were less happy. So there's this linkage to being in the present moment and actually being happy. Now, I would suggest that we face a real challenge as meditators, because I don't think the brain evolved to be present in the moment. We evolved brains that were designed to predict the future and retrospect on the past. We have prefrontal cortices that are designed to navigate future realities and reflect on past realities. It's hard for us to be in the present moment. And in our evolutionary history, this was highly adaptive for us to have this looking forward and looking back perspective. But I also don't believe that we need to be restricted by our ancient evolutionary challenges, and that we have a calling, if perhaps an obligation, to work on being present in the moment. And that, for me, meditation is about, in a sense, transcending ancient evolutionary drives to actually learn to be in this particular moment. So what's interesting is that we know that being in the moment and going through awareness training, and particularly mindfulness, has been associated with increased well-being. It's been associated with lower stress, lower depression and anxiety, decreased subjective feelings of pain. We'll talk about that. And altered connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, structural connections and functional connections, which are quite interesting. Just to give you a little bit of a cartoon of how this works, we know that the prefrontal cortex, which is this area of the brain that's very much involved in regulating, navigating, controlling, or managing our emotions, has functional and structural connections to brain areas that we think of being really central to emotion, like the amygdala. And we've all had the experience of engaging and thinking in ways that exacerbate or fan the fires of that kind of fearful state. And there's evidence to suggest that there is an association, a functional and structural association between our thinking brain and our emotional brain. And that distinction between thinking and emotional brain is a bit arbitrary, but just for now, I'll use that heuristic. And that we can actually think in ways that exacerbate those subcortical emotional or defensive brain systems. And we know that, we've talked about this in the Turgot group as kind of an amygdala hijack, where we think in a way that exacerbates and fans the flames of our particular emotion. And there's evidence to suggest that learning how to meditate and engaging in mindfulness training is very helpful in engaging the prefrontal cortex, but doing so in a way that actually can attenuate, quiet, or kind of facilitate more of an amygdala calming. And that's one of the things that we really learn how to do when we pause and we don't act impulsively, and we just kind of learn to bring mindfulness and awareness to the present moment. This isn't just psychology, and it's not just kind of functional brain imaging. It's actually associated with structural pathways that connect the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. And this is a fancy word, and don't worry about it. It's called the uncinate fasciculus. But this is a neural track, a neural fiber that connects your prefrontal cortex to your amygdala. And there's evidence that if people go through sustained meditation practices, you actually see a strengthening and an enhancement of the integrity of this pathway between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, suggesting that you can actually create structural alterations in your brain by engaging in these practices. Another area of the brain that you may have heard of is the hippocampus. This is an area of the brain that's associated with memory. It's an area of the brain that's highly plastic, and maybe probably one of the most plastic areas in the brain that we have. And when I'm talking about plastic, I'm not talking about plastic, I'm talking about malleability. And it makes sense that the area of the brain that's involved in memory would be highly malleable, because memories involve learning and adjusting and responding to our experiences, right? So you may say, well, other people who are thousands of hours of meditation training have, the ability to actually change their brains. But there's evidence to suggest that going through an 8-week meditation training, having had no prior training before coming to meditation, is also associated with structural changes in the brain. So MBSR here stands for mindfulness-based stress reduction. This is a program created by John Kabat-Zinn to really probe the ability of developing mindfulness. And what John has shown and others have shown is that going through a basic mindfulness stress reduction program for 8 weeks, not a huge commitment, is associated with changes in gray matter in the hippocampus and an actual increase in gray matter concentration in the hippocampus. And we know that the hippocampus is central to memory, but it's also central to aging. I've mentioned briefly, I mentioned this in our last talk, that there are structural associations between the amygdala, our brain's threat system, and the immune system. This is work that I have done with my colleague, Greg Miller, who's an immunologist. I'm not going to replay the biology here because we talked about this, but I just want to highlight the fact that there are well-established pathways between the brain's threat system and the immune system via the sympathetic nervous system, in a way that if your brain is in a state of threat, you're elevating and increasing inflammation. This is highly adaptive in the short term, but under situations with chronic threat, you can create chronic inflammation, which we know is associated with a lot of health problems. And I just want to mention here that there's evidence that mindfulness can actually lower peripheral inflammation. This is George Slavich recently summarized this work. And Richie Davidson has done some wonderful work actually showing that engaging in meditation can result in alterations in gene expression pathways associated with inflammation. So this is a study that Richie's group published, in which they looked at expert meditators who either did not meditate on that particular day, but they balanced the activities they engaged in, and expert meditators who did an 8-hour meditation retreat on that day. And what you see is an actual reduction in gene expression pathways associated with inflammatory signaling. So you can see that engaging in meditation is not only reducing inflammation, but it's also reducing the genomic pathways that increase inflammation. And Richie's shown also that if you go through this 8-week meditation course, this MBSR program, you can also see increases in antibodies that are associated with fighting off viruses. So not only is meditation associated with a reduction in inflammation, but it's also associated with an increase in immune processes that are effective in fighting off viruses. So it's quite profound that just training your mind has such robust effects on the brain. The last thing I'll say here before we switch back to Amy is that there's also evidence that there's a genomic footprint via meditation on our actual chromosomes. Each of us have chromosomes in every one of our cells, and each at the tips of our chromosomes are these little telomeres. And telomeres you could think of as caps to the chromosomes. They're part of the DNA that facilitates cell division. It turns out that every time a cell divides, there's a little consequence or there's a little cost to these telomeres. And telomerase activity has been associated with increased aging. So it's considered to be one of the primary mechanisms of aging. And there is evidence to suggest that if people go on an intensive meditation retreat, and this is a 3-month retreat, so this is a significant retreat, and so this is not something you do in an hour of meditation, but you actually see alterations in the strength and integrity of signaling pathways that modulate these telomeres. Easier way of saying that is that meditation can actually increase the health of these tips, which are associated with aging, which I just find to be truly remarkable and a reflection of the power that meditation can have on our biology. So with that, I will stop sharing and pivot back to Amy.
All right, thank you so much.
You may be muted, Amy, or maybe I'm just not hearing you.
Am I?
Oh, no, I hear you now.
So thank you, Robin. Something that I so appreciate about Turgar is not only that we have this, truly singular, amazing meditation teacher in Mingyur Rinpoche, but that he has drawn so many wonderful scientists to him. And so that we have all of this evidence that what we're doing is actually doing something. As if, like I say, like if you exercise, you can see the change in your body, but as you meditate, you really kind of see the change in your relationships. That's kind of been my experience. And so kind of getting back to what I was talking about earlier about, how do we transform this relationship to our mind or to our monkey mind? And it's through the cultivation of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. And so we talked a little bit about awareness, but then this idea of compassion, the kind of straightforward, traditional definition of compassion is the desire to be happy and free from suffering and to want others to be happy and free from suffering. And so, how does that help us with change? How is that going to help us to transform our minds or our relationship to our mind? Well, another favorite quote of mine is, only in the presence of compassion do we allow ourselves to see the truth. So we talk about this, relatively hostile relationship that many of us have with our minds. And, can we bring some curiosity to how did it get that way and why? Most of what we do, most of what we create around ourselves is done to protect ourselves, to help ourselves feel safe, because we want to be happy. We want to be free from suffering. And so, these defenses, these patterns, these habitual thought patterns, these emotional patterns, they arise in response to our environment once upon a time in a way that we think from the mind of a child that that's going to keep us safe. That's going to help us to be safe. But then as we become adults, our environment changes, and these same patterns, these same structures that helped us make it through our childhood now become obstacles. And so to get in touch with all of that, with what was happening back then that led to these patterns developing, the pain that it was protecting us from, or the pain, the discomfort of turning toward these things, we need compassion for that. And sometimes it's something as really to say, I know I want to be happy and free from suffering. I know that I'm sitting here meditating because of that. Sometimes that works. Sometimes I've found that just saying, this is really hard for me right now. And that's okay. That's allowed. That's the most compassionate thing I can do. So we're just bringing this kind of compassionate curiosity to whatever it is that's coming up for us on the cushion. So, some of the things that Mingyur Rinpoche says that I love so much is, everything is allowed. We're just sitting here and we just want to be with what is. Well, that's simple, not easy, but this idea that everything's allowed, and in the allowing is the compassion, and in the allowing is the forgiveness. So often we can't even bring ourselves to look at what's coming up. It just feels like I can't, we're averse to that, or, oh, I like that, I want more of that. And this idea of allowing whatever it is to come up, just that quality, you can almost feel it in your body, like, oh, or, and instead it's just like, okay, you can feel it. You almost can feel that sense, that kind of natural sense of compassion. And then we can cultivate it on purpose. We can notice that, like, this feeling I have to want to reduce my suffering, the reason that I'm here, I'm hoping to be happier. I'm hoping to understand how my mind works. Why? So I can be happier, so I can suffer less. And that's why, Candace is here, and that's why Steve's here, and that's why Robin's here. We're all essentially the same like that. And we can continue to push that out. Everyone in Chicago feels that way. Everyone in America does. Everyone on this whole planet feels that way. And yet we're all confused, and we're all screwing it up, and it's okay. It's allowed. We're allowed to screw it up, and we're also allowed to notice, and then we're allowed to do something different, but I think that idea that, can I bring some curiosity, compassionate curiosity, like, I wonder why I do this, not like, why do I do this, but I wonder why I do this. Can we bring this sort of spirit of compassionate curiosity to our experience? And then as we do that, as we increase our awareness and allow things to come up, and then we hold what comes up in compassion, then wisdom arises naturally. And so when I'm talking about wisdom, what do we mean by that? So the wisdom, and the view that Mingyur Rinpoche shares with us is this idea, wisdom is seeing things as they are. And of course, I have not achieved a great level of wisdom, but I will go from what he says, in that what we are looking at, how we are viewing the world as things, the way it is that all things are impermanent, all things are interdependent, and all things are multiple. There's no singular solid thing. Everything is like, when causes and conditions come together, a result is sure to follow. And that causes and condition will arise for a moment in awareness, and then it will dissipate and be replaced by something else. And an infinite number of causes and conditions will come together to bring about another result, and another, and another, and another. We are confused in thinking that the Amy that is here right now is the same one that was here 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. But this idea that with every breath, we're changing. I've watched my children go through puberty, lose all their teeth through this pandemic. They are not the same person that they were when we went into quarantine. Neither am I, neither are any of us. And so this idea that we're always, like Rinpoche teaches a lot on, bardos, and every morning is a new life. Every night we can kind of let go of what was. We're perpetually changing. Some people find that kind of frightening. I think it's kind of exciting. And so that's the view: impermanent, interdependent, and multiple. So that's the wisdom view. So this idea of compassion, how do we cultivate these qualities? How do we bring this to our practice? Well, Rinpoche talks about head, heart, habit. That's what he wants us to bring and to consider as we enter this path of meditation. So the head is the view, it's the knowledge, it's kind of the stuff I was just talking about: awareness, compassion, wisdom, impermanence, interdependence. Heart, that's the practice, that's the compassion. Can I sit and I meditate, and can I just be with what comes up? And then habit, that's the application, that's our conduct. So I can sit on the cushion for 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, that's great. Sometimes we refer to it as like filling your thermos, and then throughout the day you kind of sip on it. Rinpoche talks about short times, many times. That's how we practice, that's how we learn, repetition, repetition, repetition. Like if you want to build muscles, you do tens of thousands of biceps, not just one day, not just 1 week at a gym, but over and over and over. And that's sort of what we're doing. Short times, many times. So we can do that. He talks about bringing that to, something that we do every day, like when you're brushing your teeth. Can we bring meditation into our regular routine? Now, you can remember to meditate before you brush your teeth, or you could meditate while you're brushing your teeth. You could meditate before you go to bed, or you could meditate while you're doing your bedtime routine. All you need for meditation is awareness. The only obstacle to meditation is forgetting your awareness. So, what's the problem? What's the obstacle? Well, Rinpoche says our main obstacle is that we're lazy. And so he talks about how in the modern world we have our busy, lazy lifestyle. So we're all very, very busy, but yet we're very, very lazy. And we do a really good job of making excuses about why we can't meditate. We do a lot of like, oh, next summer I'll go do that retreat, you know, what have you. And what I love about him and his approach is that there's no bar. He'll say, so what's the problem? You know, oh, I need to exercise. You can make exercise your formal practice. You know, whatever it is that you're doing, you can bring your awareness to that. Just incorporate it into something you're already doing. Like, as we said, awareness is always with us. All we have to do is recognize. You know, some of my favorite times, like he jokes about, you can meditate while driving, just don't close your eyes. And I noticed almost immediately when I got into meditation that my road rage almost collapsed. And I've gone from being angry in the car to noticing that people actually in the city of Chicago pause and wave me in, you know, and so it's just again transforming that experience, our relationship to our experience. Let's see. So I do want us to practice, but I want to make sure there's nothing else that I want to say before we do it. All right, yeah. So why don't we bring to mind something that's happened this week, past few days, that was somewhat stressful, you know, just moderately stressful, no big deal, but it kind of stirred you up a little bit. Okay. And as you do that, then bring your mind back into your body and your body back to your seat. Now just allow whatever is coming up in this moment. Just let it be. You may notice images, perhaps a voice, maybe narratives, perhaps sensations or tension in your body. Nothing has to change. It's all allowed to arise within the space of awareness. You may notice that you're thinking. That's allowed, but if you can, just drop the thinking and just be in your body as best you can. You may notice familiar thought patterns or emotional patterns arising. See if you can have compassion for those patterns. Bring some curiosity. Where did they come from? How did they serve you? Do they still serve you? Just notice. See if you can be kind to the phenomena that are arising. And if you can't, that's okay too. Mingyur Rinpoche teaches us to have zero compassion. Sometimes if something seems too difficult, too challenging, you can just let it go for now. Say, perhaps sometime in the future, I'll have compassion for this. And that in and of itself can be an act of great transformative compassion for ourselves. Mingyur Rinpoche often says it's the intention to meditate that matters. What happens as we sit is irrelevant. You can just notice how that lands. Does it make sense? Can we notice if we have expectations of what meditation is supposed to look like? What kind of experience we'd like to have? What kind of one we wouldn't like to have? Just see if you can let that go and just be with whatever's coming up in the present moment. Now you can just drop the meditation and simply be present. Just to let your mind and body rest together naturally for just a minute. And then just be aware of whatever's happening in the present moment. Mingyur Rinpoche says, non-meditation is the best meditation. So to remember that we can just rest our mind and body together naturally at any time, short times, many times throughout the day, and turn our regular daily life into a meditation retreat. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rob.
Okay, can you see that, Amy? So that's a perfect segue, because the second pillar in Cortland's document or wonderful paper on human flourishing is connection, which for our purposes could really be viewed as compassion. And so connection here refers to kindness, it refers to compassion, it refers to maintaining a positive outlook, it refers to close connections with friends and family and loved ones. And as we'll learn, people outside of our circle, and that really becomes part of the teaching. So there's been some really beautiful compassion-based training programs that have been established. Richie and Cortland have developed programs. Geshe Lobsang at Emory has developed a compassion-based training program that I'll talk about. So there are really, systematic and impressive way of actually, walking people through compassion training programs. And there's evidence that these compassion programs actually reduce feelings of loneliness and social isolation. And we know that loneliness hurts. Actually, social isolation and a sense of social detachment is arguably the biggest predictor of mortality. And it's actually a bigger predictor of mortality than obesity. And I'm not talking about social isolation, even in the sense of being with people. I'm talking about having the psychological sense that there are people in your life that you can rely on, that are close to you. I think that's important in the context of COVID, because it's not talking about being out at a party. It's talking about having one or two people that you know are really confidants. And that's been shown to be a very significant protective factor for the effect of loneliness on our health and well-being. Compassion training has been associated with lower depression, reduced stress biology, a hormone called cortisol that we often hear about, and increased psychological well-being. Just to give you a sense of the value of compassion, kind of, from a scientific standpoint, this is one of my favorite studies, simple study. They gave people $100 and they say, you can spend this money on yourself or you can spend it on another person. And the people who spent the money on themselves were less happy and felt less good at the end of the day than the people who spent the money on other people. So there's something inherently rewarding about compassion. There's something inherently rewarding about this sense of pro-social behavior. And that becomes an important ingredient in our understanding of the neuroscience of compassion. This is a very interesting slide from an early study done in Ritchie's laboratory. This may even be Minka Rinpoche, but this is a monastic who was in Ritchie's lab who had their brain waves recorded while they were about to meditate and while they were meditating, so on and off meditation. And here is basically before they engage in meditation, and here is while they're actually meditating. And this is these are what are called EEG recordings, which measures basically the firing rate of the brain. You could think of an EEG recording as like the RPMs in your car. They tell you how active the brain is. And what's interesting is you can actually see that the brain is less active in this monastic, this meditator, before they're engaging in a meditative state. And I just think this is important in the sense that meditation is not just zoning out. It's a very active state. It actually often engages more activity than less activity in the brain. And I think it's just important to emphasize that. And this is during a compassion meditation, which is why I'm putting it here. So during a compassion meditation, you actually see an increase in activity. What I think is important is to return to Amy's definition of compassion, which is the sense of feeling another person's feelings and then having the intention, having the urge, having the desire to actually do something to alleviate that person's suffering. And that raises a very interesting conversation on the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy it involves basically two ingredients. One is having the ability to take another person's perspective. And second, it's the ability to feel that person's pain. And what they find is that empathy is actually associated with an activation of the brain's pain matrix. And this centers on an area of the brain called the insula. You could think of the insula as a map of your guts. The insula maps the viscera in your body. If you feel something in your gut, if you feel a strong feeling of anxiety in your gut, your viscera, the insula is a driving factor in this. And we know people with anxiety and depression have heightened insula activation because they often feel their bodies in a very kind of vibratory way. By contrast, compassion actually looks quite different in the brain than empathy. Compassion is actually associated in many cases with a reduction in the pain matrix and actually an increase in reward areas of the brain, areas associated with positive emotion. So compassion is fundamentally about not just feeling another person's pain, but having the sense of warmth of being able to take action to alleviate that person's pain. And there's actually some evidence that people who are really high in empathy get stuck in an empathy trap because they feel other people's pain. But that sense of anxiety of feeling the other person's pain actually inhibits or prohibits them from taking the action. And then what they find is that as people go through compassion training, they experience kind of an unshackling of the insula and an increase of reward systems as people get more activated by kind of the positive pro-social component of these feelings, as opposed to just sitting and stewing in another person's pain. And the word for this kind of warm-heartedness in Tibetan is sewa, and I owe that to Park, who's studying Tibetan. She taught me that word today. And it's this sense of this kind of positive emotionality as opposed to just feeling another person's pain. They've actually shown that going through a short-term compassion training can actually create this neural alteration in our brain. So this is a study by Helen Wang, who came out of Ritchie's lab. People went through a 2-week compassion training where they received 30 minutes of instruction a day. This was not an extensive compassion training versus a reappraisal training, which is just learning how to kind of think differently about stressful situations. And on an economic decision-making task where people could give money to people who were suffering, they found that people in the compassion training task or the compassion training program actually gave more money to people who were suffering than people who were in the reappraisal training. So suggesting that compassion was associated with more pro-social behavior. But what's fascinating is that they actually found that people who went through this fairly brief 2-week compassion training program actually had increased activation in these pro-social kind of rewarding area of the brain, called the ventral striatum. And this was associated with connections with the prefrontal cortex. So there was a strengthening of the association between the prefrontal cortex and these kind of rewarding areas of the brain, suggesting that compassion is really kind of a positive emotional state as opposed to just feeling other people's suffering. This next study also looked at the effect of compassion training on people who are really experts. These are the kind of expert meditators that I was discussing earlier. And I just want to point out something very briefly on this slide. They're actually looking at the insula here, which is again this kind of pain feeling, the part of the brain that's really empathizing or feeling with another person's pain. And this is a fairly complex slide. I just want to make a simple point of it. In this study, they had people listening to kind of negative or aversive stimuli while they were actually engaging in meditation or while they were resting. And they were in an fMRI scanner doing these particular states. So the solid red line here refers to an experienced meditator while they were actually meditating in an fMRI scanner, which I think is pretty cool. And then the little dot here, the dotted red lines refer to their brains in the insula when they're not actually meditating, but they're still in the fMRI scanner. The blue lines are novice meditators who are told to kind of try to create a sense of loving compassion for people, but people who don't have a lot of meditation experience, the blue lines are while they're meditating, the dotted lines are while they're resting. They were instructed to do a compassion meditation in the fMRI scanner. And I just want to highlight the remarkable difference between the expert meditators' insula activation while they were at rest versus while they were meditating. These are people with 10 to 50,000 hours of meditation experience. And it's just a proof of concept that training actually does generate an ability to, in real time, alter our brain function. I mean, I think this is just a remarkable example of people's ability with extensive training to turn on and turn off functional states in the brain, and really shows you kind of the frontiers of neuroplasticity. I also want to just mention that compassion training, it's interesting, you think of compassion training, you think of compassion as being like altruistic and selfless and giving away and maybe kind of almost at the expense of your own well-being and health. But they find that compassion training actually is associated with better health, as here reflected by reduced inflammation, increased states of reward-related brain function. So compassion here is a real kind of self-promotional state as well as a state associated with helping other people. This is the average meditation sessions per week. This is a metric of inflammation, IL-6, and just to highlight the fact that people who are meditating multiple times per week are actually experiencing reduced inflammation in the body. And we know chronic inflammation is a problem for health-related issues. And I just want to emphasize that there are people out there who are really doing a lot to develop and enhance compassion training programs. So Richie's got the kindness curriculum at UW-Madison, which is going into preschools. Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi, who I'm working very closely with at Emory University, has developed multiple programs that are designed to facilitate compassion. And there's actually a really exciting initiative that's happening right now that's initiated by the Dalai Lama and supported by the Robin Melanie Walton Foundation. Geshe Lobsang, if you don't know him, you should look into him. He's just a wonderful compassion scientist. And this is designed to create a multi-year rollout of compassion initiatives in education and healthcare and business and social services. And I actually feel quite honored to be the director of research for this program and working with the Dalai Lama and Geshe Lobsang on this initiative. Briefly, I just want to mention two other components and then we'll be done with the science and we'll turn it back to Amy. I want to The insight component of Cortland and Ritchie's paper highlights the idea of self-knowledge, the idea of self-awareness. And I just want to make 2 points on this. The first is that there's growing evidence that neuroscience and Buddhism have a fairly similar view of the mind. Neuroscience sees the mind as essentially kind of a non-entity, right? You talk about egolessness, you talk about unshackling the grip of the cement-like ego structure that we have around ourselves and just softening the edges a little bit. And there's evidence from neuroscience to suggest that there is no kind of neuro you in the middle of your brain. Your brain is a product of multiple thousands and kind of neural networks happening, and you can't find the you in your brain. There's no little you in your brain. You are an emergent property of a fundamental system. And there's evidence that meditation can actually alter in positive ways the neural networks in your brain that are associated with cognition and emotion. The last study I'll discuss is actually one of my favorite studies, and this relates to this interesting idea and insight of what's called the sticky self. And Mingyur Rinpoche and others talk about this idea of the sticky self, which is the idea that, we get very reified in ourselves and we ruminate and we grind and we think and we perseverate over our thoughts. And if something bad happens and we kind of play it over and over and over. And Cortland in this paper refers to this as the sticky self, or this kind of stickiness. And I just want to highlight this beautiful study that was done by Antoine Lutz and Richie Davidson's, kind of showing the ability of meditation to unstick the self from stressful stimuli. So they actually looked at the insula, which again, you can think of as this pain region of the brain, in response to painful stimuli. And they brought people in and they exposed them to actual painful stimuli. This was basically a heat plate that they could put on the people's arms that is quite painful. It's very safe, but it's quite painful. And they then did 2 things. They said, we're going to tell you when the pain is coming, and then we're going to give you the pain. And they wanted to study the insula, this part of the brain that really responds to anxiety and physical pain, in response to the anticipation of the pain and in response to the actual pain, and then see what the brain looks like after the exposure to the pain. And in novice meditators, they found, as you can imagine, pain activated the brain's pain metrics, including the insula. So it activated areas of the brain associated with pain, and it activated this insula, which is a part associated with kind of mapping the emotional pain in the body. Furthermore, novice meditators were really freaked out during the anticipation of the pain and during the recovery period. It was a stressful experience. They were really getting worked up in their brain during the anticipation of the upcoming pain. By contrast, experienced meditators, they also experienced the pain. They actually, ironically, experienced and showed more activation in their brain actually to the painful stimulus. So the idea is meditation is not getting rid of pain. They were in it, they were feeling it. But intriguingly, they had very little to no activation in the insula before and after. And I think that really plays to what Amy's talking about, is that meditation is learning to feel what you're feeling, but then let go of the grip of the narrative and the story and the stickiness that can cause it to stick around for so long. And the final thing that Cortland and Ritchie highlight is the sense of purpose. And I just want to say one point on this, which is that purpose is associated with better psychological well-being. It's associated with better memory and cognitive ability. It's associated with lower stress biology, and actually more activity in positive emotional brain regions. And purpose here really refers to the idea of having a kind of a North Star for your life. A guiding principle that you feel like you're on the planet to do. And we know that this guiding principle, this sense of having a purpose, of having a goal, of having a meaning for your footprints on the planet, is associated with a lot of positive outcomes, including increased activation in the brain's reward region. And there's evidence that for people over the age of 70, a sense of purpose, a sense of knowing that you're on the planet for something, whether it's volunteer or parenting or grandparenting or what have you, is actually the single most important predictor of longevity. And so with that, I'd just like to close my comments by highlighting the fact that I think there's compelling evidence that the brain is a malleable organ. It's designed to change in response to experience. And we have some agency over what we put into it and the changes that we can actually see. Amy mentioned this many times, short time. I think there's compelling evidence that small changes can have measurable effects. But she also alluded to the fact that the brain is like a muscle. And if you're going to see sustained kind of continuous changes to the brain, you're going to need to actually do the hard work. I'm speaking to myself more than anyone, of actually sitting on the couch and doing the investment and seeing the payoff. And this is nicely summarized in the book. If you want to read about some of the work that I summarized today, this is a nice book by Richie, and you can feel free to email me at nuslock@northwestern.edu. And with that, I will turn it back to Amy so we can have a brief sit and maybe a little bit of a conversation. Thank you.
So thank you, Robin. I was really smiling just thinking about a couple of things. One, how our group, our sitting group that we've been meeting together for 10, 11 years now, how we really do hit each of these 4 pillars together. You know, that we are cultivating our awareness. We have definitely developed, I think, deep friendship and connection over the years. You know, we are intentionally working with insight, with, you know, observing what we're doing, what's coming up for us. And it's gives me a great sense of purpose, you know, and I know I've heard Richie say the same thing, that, you know, once you get involved with this stuff, that, you know, kind of helping to bring it to more and more people is, I don't know what we could do that's better with our lives. And I feel like sharing the joy of living teachings, you know, Mingyur Rinpoche's basic meditation teachings, awareness, compassion, and wisdom, is the greatest way to help, you know, increase happiness and reduce suffering that a regular person like me could come across. And so I am very, very grateful for that. And I was also, I have to say, proud of myself, but not in a puffy way, about thinking about when I had a drug-free birth with my second child. And, you know, and I had my picture of Rinpoche on the window, and that I would sit there visiting with the nurses and then just start screaming in pain, you know, doing my contraction, and then it would drop, and then I'd go right back to the conversation. So anyway, and then, oh, hang on a second. Ah, you know, and so I definitely really felt my feelings in that moment, but then it was gone, you know. And I remember the nurse was like, okay, that was a bad one. Nope, they're all good, because without them, the baby doesn't come out, you know. So changing my relationship to my experience. So anyway, we do want to have a couple of minutes, so we're just going to practice together for just a couple of minutes. And when we talk about, you know, compassion, you know, considering others, increasing our awareness, how all these things that we're noticing, a reduction in inflammation, increase in pro-social behavior, all of these things that feel good, we can tell that, and then that our body likes too. So why is that, you know? And I don't, you know, there's some science around this. I know it's somewhat controversial, but this idea of basic goodness, you know, Mingyur Rinpoche would say that all beings have basic goodness. That's our true nature. It's just basically good. Underneath it all, under all the patterns, under all the problems, we are all basically good. And that cultivating these qualities of compassion and wisdom and awareness, that it's like a coming home, that we're homesick for our true nature. And so just to rest in these qualities is something that is like a coming home. So maybe we could just spend a couple of minutes coming home to ourselves, and then we'll have a chance to answer a few questions. So again, just get comfortable. Let your mind be open and present. No need to block your senses or stop thinking, but you also don't need to be distracted or lost in thought. Just let your awareness be as open and spacious as you can, completely at ease in this moment. Now see if you can notice the impulses that are arising in your mind and body. Maybe there's a desire to move, to react to a thought or feeling. Whatever you notice, just recognize that each passing experience is an expression of your basic goodness, of your fundamental desire to be happy and free from suffering. You don't need to change your experience in any way. Just embrace each moment, each impulse, each thought, with spacious awareness. just relax back into that open awareness, that spacious, knowing quality, and just rest there for a few moments. Okay, so I know we only got a few minutes left, but if anyone has any questions for Robin or anything that I can answer, I would be happy to. Anybody? Yeah, David.
Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging, and thank you so much, Amy and Robin. I've noticed in myself there are times where I can't tell that something is helping or not. And like I had a big disagreement with a very close person to me 2 days ago. And so almost as if there's no taste to my experience. I'm not sure where it'll end up. Um, so that also has to do with compassion and feeling positively motivated. Sometimes I feel I'm just waiting out a storm. That's what end up happening. But in any case, there is no taste. I want to highlight that sometimes through meditation. I'm sure there's a question in there somewhere.
Well, I would just say you can be with the no taste, right? Sometimes it's like that, and that's okay. That's just where you are right now. That's what I would say. And just see if you can just be kind with that. Have some compassion for that.
Yeah, I would just like to say, David, I always have so much gratitude for the honesty and the true commitment you bring to this work, and just, so hopefully you feel a sense of support from all of us when you're in those moments, as I feel from you when I'm in those moments. And I think that's really the sangha of a community. So.
And then I'm seeing a question here in the chat. What happens when the anxiety and stress you are trying to tackle is exasperated by awareness? Sometimes I feel like being aware of my stress causes a feedback loop, which increases the symptoms associated with it. Well, I would say that does happen. That we would, as we become aware of something, sometimes we notice that it does get to be more. But it's changing, right? And so what Mingyur Rinpoche talks about, he's got a 4-step process. And so, like, let's say you decided to meditate on anxiety, and it starts to get really, really big, and then you feel like it's overwhelming. And so what they would say would be to try something else. So maybe you decide to shift your attention to sounds in the room, and you're just listening to sound. And then the anxiety, that's a really sticky one. It's like, no, come over here, and it's having its way. And then you might decide to pull back and look at what we would call like a booster, like what's underneath that anxiety. Is it fear? Can you look at the fear? Can you be with the fear? And perhaps then it's still getting bigger and bigger and you feel like it's just too much. Then you can just drop the whole thing and take a break. Go for a walk, read a book, call a friend. This is not an endurance test. This is an act of compassion. And sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is say, I want to take a break. But you may also find, though, as things may get bigger and then they get smaller. That things are just, that's always changing. And again, to remember that this isn't like some kind of brilliant reverse psychology where we're trying to befriend something in order to get it to go away. We really do want to bring some curiosity, and can we be with what's coming up? And if it does seem too big today, then perhaps zero awareness of that today, and perhaps someday you can come back to it.
I think the only thing I would say to complement that is, the brain's a learning machine. And sometimes I actually liked what David said of just, I'm waiting it out. And sometimes just being willing to stay with it and pause and not, kind of bolt into comfort, behaviors creates that muscle that I'm just going to sit with this a little bit longer, a half second longer, 5 minutes longer, 10 minutes longer. And the next time that moment happens, you've got now a new experience of having learned to sit with it for 5 minutes longer, 10 minutes longer. And that kind of is the idea of going to the gym. I mean, just basically pausing small times with a lot of compassion for prolonged, for the rest of our lives. That's a pretty good task for the rest of our lives. And that just kind of builds up that pause and that waiting muscle, and hopefully doing that with some compassion.
Yeah, Anne.
Question. So it was probably about 9 months ago, I had two things happen in very short order. One is that I watched this documentary called Cracked Up. It was the story of Daryl Hammond on Netflix. He was a comedian on SNL. And it turns out he had a very abusive childhood. And in that documentary, a guy named, I think it was like Bessel van der Kolk, talked about that they now know that those early childhood experiences actually change the brain, right? And that the good news is that brain can change later on, but that it leaves this imprint. And about maybe a week and a half later, I was reading a book and there was a quote by Donald Winnicott: "The thing that you most fear has already happened." And I really, this question really struck me, and I meditated on it. It's like, is that true for me? And as I sat and I thought, wow, the bear in my mind that keeps jumping out at the woods has a lot to do with my childhood. Like when I thought about the fear of like humiliation and like non-existence, sort of like this feeling like you are nothing, I could put myself back in like a child. And I thought, oh my God, there is some trigger. And I just was like, maybe this guy is onto something. But I guess my question is, are those imprints left from childhood harder to change than maybe other negative coping mechanisms that we've picked up along the way?
Well, you raise an interesting question, because it pertains to the idea of sensitive periods in brain development. And there are periods of time where the brain seems to be more responsive to input from the environment. And one of those periods of time appears to be the first 5 to 6 years of life. And that's where a lot of the kind of foundations of the brain, the foundations of the immune system, the foundations of the systems of the body are really kind of establishing their set point. So I think there is, some compelling evidence that yes, if something probes an ancient pattern in us, an ancient wound, whatever the word you want to say, it's gonna be sticky. It's gonna be hard, and it may hijack us in ways that we consciously don't even fully understand. But then I think it comes back to the way you started your comment, which is that in a sense, like learning to stay with those feelings and kind of getting familiar with those feelings then provides that learning experience. Well, I've done it in my past. Maybe I can do it with this, or I can do it with that, or I can do it with that. So the very thing we fear, the very thing we struggle with actually becomes the teaching opportunity that then we can take forward and say, I've gained the ability to stay here. I bet I could stay there as well. It's at least how I kind of frame the experience. I don't know if Amy, you want to say anything?
Well, and I'm so moved that you brought those two people up, because both of them are really part of why I got into meditation in the first place, and it brings to mind Sophie Rinpoche, who is Mingyur Rinpoche's brother, would often do this teaching he calls real, not true. Mm-hmm. So when we notice activation coming up, when we notice reactivity coming up, that's real. It's really happening. And we're not trying to deny that it's happening. We can feel it. So you get flooded. Let's say you're supposed to meet your partner and they're 20 minutes late, and you get flooded and you're so angry and you start shaking and you're sweating and you're so upset. And okay, this is really happening. But is it true? Is it based on current circumstances, or has something old been touched? All the time we're talking about getting triggered. Everybody's triggered. Everybody's triggered all over the place. We're all triggering each other. Well, it almost has lost its meaning, but you can't get triggered unless there is something there to get triggered, you know. So a trigger is something that happens in the present that feels familiar. It feels like the thing. And then so whenever you notice, is my reaction doesn't seem out of proportion to what's happening in the present, then that's an idea. That's the idea that something old has been touched. So if we're asking over and over, is this real, not true? This is, then we're honoring our experience, but then is this about the present, or has something old been touched? And that idea, from Winnicott of this has already happened, you know, I like what Robin said, about that we could, maybe that'll give us some strength, but I would say so much of it, we don't know, we don't have, because a lot of these things happen in these very sensitive periods before we have mental recall. So we have implicit memory of it. You can feel it in your body. You can feel it in your nervous system. That's what's coming up. So when Rinpoche, that was actually one of Sogyal Rinpoche's instructions, can you have compassion for the pattern, not the person? Just, can I be compassionate with whatever it is that's coming up in me right now? Can I bring that curiosity? Can I ask myself, is this real, not true? Breaks the identification with it. And then we can start to hold it and be with it, And I think that, I can tell you from my experience that that you can rewire your nervous system. You can overcome, early childhood adversity. It warmed my heart to see Robin's slide about the foster kids whose inflammation was going down with the practice. That is part of what is so motivating to me. I'm excited about the future. Robin and I might be able to do some things, bringing some of these practices to parents, all over, of all different types, to get in touch with this, again, basic human, sentient being goodness that we all have. What I love about meditation is it's the most democratizing thing there is. We all can do it. We all have basic goodness. We all have awareness. And so, so to me, it's just because something is impossible doesn't mean you give up, And so it's a worthy endeavor, even if it is a little harder if it's the stuff from all the way back. So I know we've gone over, so I want to honor y'all's time. It's getting late. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Madeline, for all you do to make these things happen.
Thank you, Amy, for all that you do, and for Turgar, and thank you, Madeline.
And thank you, everyone, for being here. This was a lot of fun, and I'm really glad we got to do this to help us make it through this COVID winter. And so here comes spring, and things are starting to look up a little bit. So if you want to unmute and say goodbye, it was wonderful to have you all here. And please join us any Sunday, 9:30 to 11. You can email us at chicago@turgar.org, and we can send you a link to join us.